Hi, can you
Hi.
hear me?
Good. Yes. How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. I'm so sorry to get back to you. I'll let you know that I'm in my mother-in-law's house in Gelma, and my
Oh,
daughter's around, and so we'll try to keep noise down, but you might hear like a child in the background yelling like "More
it's
zaitu."
fine, it's fine.
Nice to meet
So
you.
your name is Elizabeth
Yes.
and you're from Algeria,
No, I'm from the United States.
right?
Yes. Yeah, I'm from
So
Pittsburgh.
how did you end up studying the Algerian history?
Okay, excellent. You want to do English؟ عربية فرنسوية.
عربية.
أنا كنت في ماريكان، كنت متخصصة في اللغة الفرنسوية في الجامعة.
Okay.
And I was very interested. I might just do English because I'm a little nervous.
براحتك براحتك. All good.
I was interested in I like doing research about history.
Mm,
Uh, and I was also really interested in history of colonialism. I think because, and I've only recently started to think about this with what's going on right now in Gaza and like Irish solidarity. But
mm,
my grandmother's family was really impacted and participated really to a really great degree in the Irish Revolution against British occupation. And so when I was growing up, my dad would tell me stories about like, colonialism is very bad. It's something that's like very understudied in school. You're not going to hear about it. You're not going to hear about the US being a settler colony when you go to school in the US. So you need to be very mindful that colonialism is there and it's very bad. And you need to be very careful about how you're understanding the history that's being taught to you in the classroom. And so I think that that kind of made me really curious about other types of histories beyond these sort of narratives that were being told to me. And then I was a French major in college, and we didn't have a French historian that I could work with, but I wanted to use French to do history work. And there was someone there that worked on Algeria. It was very just by chance. And I think I was really just, I think like so many individuals that get interested in Algerian history who are not from Algeria, I think the revolution is just
yeah.
this really massive moment in world history and just a very interesting, different sets of stories and different narratives about that history. And then I was interested in post-independence North Africa, and then I learned I could learn Arabic and be able to use Arabic and French. And I decided I through starting to learn Arabic, I realized I really liked learning the language, and then it was really great.
Mm,
I got to learn Fusha and Darja, and it was just really exciting. So that's kind of how in a very roundabout way, and just by chance.
wow.
So originally fascination by history, not fascination, but being careful about colonial histories, kind of due to family history, and then also just by chance, someone working on Algerian history at the university I was at, and then wanting to learn Arabic.
Wow. That's nice. So if I will ask you the next questions in Darija,
اوكي كمان
well,
تحب
let's try. Let's
تسمعني
give it a
شوية
try.
رني شوية عيانة وبلك نفهمش بس لازم أحول وحنشوفه إن شاء
Okay,
الله
great. So I remember that you mentioned in one of your interviews that
مهم.
every president era made the Algerian citizen achieve or obtain a certain thing. And if that did not happen in that era, he missed the
Mhm.
opportunity.
Yeah, so there was a joke about that if you didn't get, and there's a couple of different versions of the joke, but one of them is if you didn't get housing during the time of Ahmed Ben Bella, then you would never get housing. If you didn't get an education under Boumediene, you'd never get an education. I think it was if you didn't make money under Shadli, you would never make money.
Yeah.
Uh, and then if you didn't die during the time of Zerwell, then you'll never die. So it's kind of, I think Boudiaf, there was something, I think
Oh,
maybe perhaps you never didn't make love during the time of Boudiaf, you would never. So it was a joke. I'm trying to
mm.
remember the original transcript, but yes, that was one joke that I found at least in two or three sources.
The question is, what are the things that dark political humors express that other means of expressions cannot express spontaneously?
Yeah, so I think that so the book as a whole looks at different types of political humor that comment on national politics. And so some of that does get into humor and trauma when we're talking about the colonial period, but also getting into different periods of post-independence Algerian history. And we do know as researchers, there's a couple of different studies that have shown this, but humor can actually be a really good way of processing trauma, and taking a bit of a distance from it, but at the same time acknowledging it. And so I think that at times humor was maybe a way to deal with some of the tension surrounding different conflicts that were happening over national politics. And I think particularly in the 1990s, there was it depended kind of who I spoke to because I did speak to some journalists that lived through that period, and that was a very tense period for them. But it seemed like for different folks, the jokes kind of had different, particularly. So I look at jokes and cartoons as a way of looking from 1920 to the early 21st century, because of some issues with things like theater in the 1990s was not it continued to exist in Algeria, but it wasn't quite as kind of vibrant as it had been earlier. And then also because other forms kind of in terms of like sketch comedy that was more open, that kind of was also not kind of waned a bit in the 1990s. But humor in the form of jokes and cartoons in particular kind of are a constant between the period of 1930s, 40s, and then also humorous songs as well are also there, but jokes as well. So I ended up focusing on jokes and on cartoons in the form of bande dessinée, in the
Hmm.
form of dessins de presse, les caricatures. And so that was something that was sort of the two forms that I focused on. And then, yeah, I think humor, or I think there were lots of different periods of tension, and the humor does have this unique way of allowing folks to kind of deal with tension in a way that might be a bit more lighthearted, might be a bit more accessible. Not all
Okay.
forms of expression are as accessible, for instance, as jokes. So a little bit easier to kind of get a message out using a joke versus having to publish a cartoon. And then also, I think as well, messages could be a little bit less perceptible in the form of humor because humor plays with a lot of ambiguity and has sort of
Okay.
innate ambiguity to it and a potential for multiple interpretations. So sometimes I think messages could be coded in ways that really powerful, and you can see there's kind of multiple layers to the joke, but it might not be legible to all people.
Can you remember some examples now?
I'm trying to think of um I think let me just off the top of my head.
Take your
I
time.
don't know why kind of a kind of a bit of a challenge, but there was one joke from the colonial period that dealt with racist ideas about racial miscegenation. So this idea that if there were French women who happened to marry Algerian Muslim men or had relations with Algerian Muslim men, that would be a horrible, awful thing. And that joke is one that there's a lot of like that's a very serious the accusation potentially towards a Muslim man at that time of a rape or assault of a French Christian woman would have been even not true at all. And we know that there's all these sort of different cases across different colonial contexts, also in the U.S. As well with in African American history of sort of these fake accusations. And so this was a really serious kind of fearful thing that could happen or could be kind of someone could be accused of. And there was a joke that kind of dealt with that a little bit. That was actually talking about there was a plantation or a large landowner who was very wealthy, who was a colon, who was a
Hmm.
settler in Algeria, decided to leave his precious female, like well-bred dog. And so this is kind of coded for kind of idea of like a
Uh,
daughter, and that he decided to leave the daughter in the care or the dog in the care of one of his workers. Um, and I'm trying to think, yeah. And so the guy, he's like, I'm gonna go leave, but make sure that she doesn't this my precious like purebred female dog doesn't have any relations with any kind of dirty local dogs. And so this is very kind of
mm,
and then the guy comes back and the dog is pregnant, very clearly pregnant. And so the guy turns to his worker and is like, "What did you do? How dare you have let her become pregnant?" He was like, what can I tell you? She was pregnant before you left." It's sort of a joke of like really the kind of is dealing with
uh,
a very dark subject, but in sort of a like a lighter manner. And I think that kind of comes up. But I also think too that there's ways that humor. So the point of the book and what I'm sort of looking at is first of all, in Algeria, it's just a really important form of political discourse. I think because of the accessibility of humor in terms, especially in terms of jokes, that they could be spread really easily. You don't have to have any material to really create them. You just have to have
yep.
some subjects that are commonly understood. And so anyone's following like national politics can make any joke, kind of spread it around. And so to kind of notice that, just, and this was from living in Algeria, but also in Tunisia as well, having some kind of similar common kind of cultural practices, but seeing that particularly that humor could be a really powerful way for people to comment on politics. And also was understood by states to be a really powerful mode of expression. There's actually an FLN official in, I think, believe the mid 1960s who kind of openly
Okay.
announces, comes out in Al Mujahid, you know, we need to make sure that we kind of amp up our cultural production. We need to make sure that the revolution knows how to laugh. And
Mm.
so there's these bande dessinées, these dessinateurs, like Slim, like a few others that come out in the late 60s who are drawing, who are satirizing the bataille d'Alger, like that are thinking about, you have Hassan Terho, which is actually kind of a commentary on the faux mujahideen. So these are really kind of, so it's just interesting that this has been different states. And so I also showed that sort of the colonial state tried to do this as well, tried to kind of harness humor to get Algerian soldiers to be fully engaged in during the Second World War in the Free French Army, that there was a lot of surveillance of theater on the part of the colonial state. And the French colonial archives are just like, they sent agents, the colonial administration, the police sent agents to every single showing of every theatrical play that was put on by Algerian Muslims. And they'd
Mm.
sit in the audience and make notes about like when the audience was laughing. So different political powers have understood it to be
Oh.
potentially something that would be really potentially influential towards public opinion. And then also different actors have used it in really powerful and poignant ways to make really different critical commentary. And we think about something like the drawings of Ali Dilem and Dilem's work being really poignant, particularly as he was critiquing that sort of earlier Bouteflika period. And that's when he
Okay.
ended up with a number of political, or a number of trials and a number of kind of accusations of violating law.
What's his name again? Ali?
Ali Dilem.
Ali Dilem. Okay.
Yeah, so he's probably the most well known from the last maybe 30 years, of the dessinateur de presse, the caricaturiste,
Mm.
and who was working for Liberté, and before that worked for Le Matin. And he was
Okay.
actually hired initially by Said Maqbal, who was somebody that did editorial pieces, but also had some pretty poignant humor to them as well.
Nice. A general question about humor. Why is
Mhm.
there a close connection between it and the sex?
And just, you mean, so I think that humor oftentimes plays with taboos.
Okay.
And so sex is something that, depending on your society, can be a very taboo topic. And I think that that's kind of something that definitely makes it so that sexual jokes, and there have been some scholars that have tried to estimate like what percentage of a certain society's jokes are sexual in nature. I did saw some evidence from a couple different sources that particularly women's humor in Algeria, I didn't focus on that for the book, but could sometimes be a little bit raunchy as well, and that could deal with kind of sex. But I think that I think it's um, I think that it is because of that sort of taboo issue, and that humor can really kind of play with taboos and kind of push limits. And I think that that's one of the reasons why sex ends up being a focus of a lot of different jokes.
Okay. But do you consider sex as a taboo in the United States?
I don't think, no, and I think it just depends what kind of like, so I'm trying to think about this, like,
Because the comedy and the humor in the United States
yeah. Yeah, no, no, I
focus
think
a
there's
lot on sex.
yeah, I think there is a lot of focus on sex, and it's not that, maybe, I mean, I think there is kind of like a still like puritanical attitude towards sex. So in the US, and this is just obviously very generalizing and not necessarily scientifically based, but there is like a huge, push among evangelical Christians, other forms of Christianity. Um, it's still being a Christian majority country. Uh, for kind of a high value placed on virginity, and individuals who are teenagers pledging to never have sex. So sex is taboo among some
Okay.
communities, and certain types of sex is taboo. And so I think that that's one of I think some folks, and I'm thinking of one comedian in particular, Taylor Tomlinson, who grew up in a very Christian environment, and she now tells mostly sex jokes because she sort of talks about kind of starting off her comedy career in sort of these comedy clubs that were in churches and performing in churches. And then now is kind of like eventually got kicked off of that circuit because she told a sex joke, and now much of her humor is pretty raunchy. So I think among some, communities that it is there's aspects of sex that can be very taboo. I also think there's
Okay.
sort of a human, um, and I'm trying to think about Mikhail Bakhtin, who is a really famous Russian philosopher, writes
Okay.
about carnival and this like kind of concept. He writes about sort of medieval carnival, and there's this sort of moment where a state allows and these are states, medieval states, so not quite as centralized, but they allow um, populations who are more working class or are sort of normal peasant populations to be able to have carnival at least once a year where they get to really let loose and make fun of the rulers, as sort of
Mm,
like allowing tension to be dissipated. But something that actually he maybe was trying to comment on, he was writing in the context of the Soviet Union. And so maybe he was trying to comment a little bit about what was happening in terms of censorship. And maybe even like alluding to some Soviet humor, Soviet practices and performances. And so he does write that there's a lot of sort of ideas, things that are kind of grotesque, really come out in sort of carnival. And I think there's this sort of like earthly humanness and sort of universality to sex is a very big human universal, but it ends up being taboo in so many societies. So when people kind of have a moment to release tension, they might turn to sex as a topic. But also, once again, to maybe push taboos or to play with taboos or yeah, I think
okay.
that's another. Of course, these are very.
Yeah.
There's a number of different theories. I don't know if we want to get like super into the theory, but
Clear.
those, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, in the last Hirak, the Algerian movement, I
Mhm.
remember one of the French channels made a documentary about the opinion of the youth about the Algerian movement, and there were
Mhm.
opinions that almost did not express the opinion of the majority. But for the press, the French press, they were very excited because it's gonna spread and it's go viral. And the reaction of, let's say, the Algerian people, who, in the social media especially, uh, that it is true that this group exists in Algeria, but it's not the majority. Is the humor highlights minorities too, and that's it?
Well, I think
Only
I'm very careful.
minorities?
So I think that the Harak, there was a sense at the time, and I think we're still. I'm an historian, so it's very hard for us to comment on more recent events because we're not political scientists. And I know I have friends who are political scientists who are like, stay in your lane and take some time between events to make sense of them. But I think there was sort of an attitude that this was at least a moment. It was hard to measure. And I have a friend who writes about this, Arthur Asaraf, who writes about for a blog that Malika Rahal has called The Texture of Time. And these are both historians that work on different areas of or different moments in Algerian history, but talking about how do you kind of determine how many people are in a crowd. And so the how many people are really coming out across Algeria to initially push against the fifth mandate for Abdelaziz Bouteflika, and those kind of questions came up as to how representative is the movement. And I think that that's something that's really hard to measure. But I think it's important we're talking about humor that comments in national politics to not take a sort of even if something's a very popular joke that gets repeated again. So, like for instance, there were lots of jokes about Shadli bin Shadid. Like it was, it was basically kind of its own genre of political joke
Mm.
in among sort of Algerian humor. That there were tons and tons of jokes about him. And you could read that, and some folks have. So John Phillips, Martin Evans, and also Dylan.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can.
You can hear? Okay. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
I wasn't my end.
yeah.
Okay, sorry. We're also internet might go out. So but I was saying um what was I gonna say? And I think Ali Dilemma
You were
also
talking about Shadli Ben Jadid.
really jokes, yeah, that we have to be careful. So there were a lot of jokes about him, and there were some, including I think Dilem said this in an interview at one point, but that there was disappointment after Boumediene that Shadli wasn't seen as being quite as good of a president as Boumediene had been. Boumediene spoke Arabic, and people have different views on Boumediene in that period and different views on Shadli. So once again, you need to be careful not to overgeneralize, but that you could sort of see it as sort of a sign of Shedley not being seen quite as serious by the quote unquote Algerian people, right? And we need to be careful because who are we talking about specifically? And to not overgeneralize. So I think the Harak, it would be a mistake to say it was sort of all Algerians, the Shab, like who is the Shab, like who makes up the Shab? But it's a very important thing to be like, it's such an important concept, like the people, right? But it's who are we talking about? Where are they? Which communities? So I think we can never really take an example of humor or even a protest where there seemed to be lots and lots and lots of involvement and say that it's necessarily representative. And my understanding too of the Harak is that it was kind of more different groups of people coming together. So individuals that were participating for different reasons among those that did participate, right? And so that's obviously not capturing the entirety of the Algerian population. And so I do mention in my book to be really careful with these jokes, and they can give us some perspective into different takes on different events from different communities, but they're not really, it can't be representative of sort of some sort of popular conscious, the sort of widespread popular opinion. I think it's really careful about that, I think.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's also
Oh,
minorities. Sorry, just to say too, like
yeah,
minorities
yeah.
use jokes, or there can be jokes that could be the majority kind of against a minority. So there is um Murad Yeles, who has given a lecture, and I think he published a paper on the mascara jokes, the mascara jokes of Oran, and how part of that was a response to kind of increased populations. That was kind of a more regional type of genre of joke. And I'm so sorry for, I don't know why I might not be pronouncing that right now. It's just a little bit late, but
No,
that's an
it's fine.
example. It's not a national sort of something that might be presented as being Algerian humor, but it is something that represented sort of a certain tension between new arrivals to Iran that were coming from places like Mascara, and then that's kind of how the joke sort of starts. And I think it's now been appropriated and kind of shared around different Algerian communities. But yeah, minorities can also use humor, but we need to be careful not to read a political joke or cartoon or any sort of piece of humor as being necessarily representative of particularly an entire the national community that's incredibly diverse.
Okay, great. What I know is that the humor is a description of the political situation of the country, but can the humor affect the political arena, and how? If you have any examples.
That's a huge a debate in humor studies as to whether, and I'm just checking, are you, I heard something on your end, so are you okay?
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
hearing,
fine. I'm just in a co-working space, and
oh, gotcha. Okay, okay. I just know
yeah,
for some like maybe I wasn't coming through.
no, all
Um,
good.
yeah, so I'm gonna get back to the question about can humor itself actually change politics? And I think folks who work on social movements would say it does because it does help movements, let's say a protest movement or an organization that's trying to get folks to join, whether it's formal or an informal movement. It can be really helpful for kind of framing what their ideology is, to kind of spread that ideology. It can be important to be trying to speak to a broader public and say, this is what we're all about. And to give an example of that, I think during the Harak, there was this like silmiya silmiya, like this we're peaceful, we're peaceful. This is about peaceful protest. And I think humor was a real kind of sign of that. And Hiam Shorfa has written a little bit about that as well for Jaidalia, that it was kind of a framing device, which I think we could argue being very important, but it's hard to always measure the import or the impact of the language. And this is a big debate in humor studies, and there's a big debate between two scholars in particular. What's interesting is that at one point, Ali Dilem is on trial for a cartoon, and he kind of argues that this is just my interpretation of something. It's not a bigger thing. But the state was concerned. So I think that different powers have understood it to be something that could influence politics. And in that regard, as long as a political entity views that a joke could be or a cartoon could be seditious or subversive, then I think that humor does have power in one way or another.
Okay, great. So yeah, the last question.
Mhm.
Um, I know that you collect in your books a lot of jokes, but the difficult question is, can you choose two or three jokes and analyze them as a conclusion to our meeting?
Yeah, so I think I always offer too that I think as historians we have to be really open to, we have different types of sources that we use. I'm actually teaching a historical methodology class right now. I teach at Appalachian State University, which is part of the University of North Carolina system, and it's a great job, and I love my students. And I just want to just shout out my university. They're really supportive.
Nice.
They let me go to Algeria all the time. I'm like teaching online. So just like shout out to my really nice department, and the people I work with, my students who are fantastic. So we talk about historical methodology, and it's always, as historians, we're using sources and we're trying to interpret them to be as accurate as possible and to try to get as best of a vision of the past as possible. And especially with humor, where there's multiple, sometimes ambiguous meanings embedded in a joke. And it's very contextual. So some of these, particularly newspaper humor that was coming and appearing like day by day by day, it's hard to remember maybe what was the context in which that cartoon, particularly, I
Mm,
can think what's going on background nationally sort of for that month, but I don't know like what was maybe the conversation the day before that the cartoon might be subtly referencing. So you're always going to kind of miss parts of things. Um, and so I just want to start that way by saying, like, if I'm offering an interpretation, like it's not the definitive one. I also want to be very careful too, especially if this is for an Algerian audience. The book is using different examples. I tried to use examples that kind of different pieces of humor that were either cartoonists' work, like Slim, who is kind of seen as the father of bande dessinée. I didn't really have time to get into Hassan Terho, but like kind of these works that were really seen as emblematic of a so-called Algerian humor or that were really popular. So a joke, if I could find it in multiple places, I could see
mm,
that as maybe perhaps having a bit more of resonance. Um,
okay.
but also to say too that the book is not a sort of exhaustive study of Algerian humor and all types of Algerian humor, and even some of the most important. Like I didn't get into Carnaval fi Dashra, which is like a really, really, really important movie in Algerian comedy,
Yeah.
or some other things that are really important. So it's not an exhaustive study of Algerian. I just don't want people to get offended if they're like, how could she not talk about Inspector Tahar? Like, how could she forget to talk? Like it's kind
Yeah,
of
yeah. Got
more broad
it.
about the topic. But a couple of jokes that I think were really interesting was there was, a testament to how many jokes there were about Shali was there was sort of a meta joke that was Shali one day got so fed up with, and I don't have actual transcript in front of me in Darja, but like he got so fed up with the number of jokes that there were about him that he sent out the secret services to collect all of the jokes on him and to bring them to him in the presidential residence. And so they bring everything to his office, all of these jokes, and they collect them. They put them in a big bag. And so Shadli in the middle of the night goes to the Shadli Ben Jadid in the middle of the night goes to the Beit Ajay, and he goes out in a little bit at a rowboat with all these jokes in this huge bag, and he
Mm-hmm.
tosses them into the bay. And then 2 seconds later, all of the fish in the bay rise up to the surface, dead from laughter. It's a joke that really kind of tests that there were like lots, it's one of my favorites. That there were kind of a lot of jokes about him and that maybe he was sensitive. And I don't know if I think there was
Okay.
one breadcrumb or two that I came across that said that he was like aware of them and was a bit sensitive about them. So that might be maybe a testament to that. Trying to think about other jokes that were really or they really
there's a point
landed
where
well.
essentially someone
We're seeing
has pretty
terrorists that come to his house
trying to
and are
think of
threatening his
like
family, and he really kind of notices that they're going to spare the women, and so the terrorist then leads in terms to him and says, what's your name? And he says, my name is Muhammad, but everyone in the neighborhood calls me Aisha. So just as a way
Yeah.
of self, like a female name, as a way of kind of getting out. But Abdurrahman Musawi, who's a really great anthropologist who's written about this topic, and I kind of agreed with him on this, that there was a sort of a hint from some of these jokes that there was a sense of a sense that the situation of the conflict in the 90s made it really hard for men in particular to be
Mhm.
able to protect their families as they wanted to, and that was sort of a sense of, and once again, you don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but it was a sense of um, there was a sense that there was a lot of fear in that, and actually looking back at the numbers, I'm working on this right now, but the there was a lot of talk about there were women that were very harmed during the conflict and children in the 1990s, but the most of the casualties were actually men because of a
Mhm.
lot of things happening more militarily. But even though it was sort of even described, and I think there was a French intellectual, Jacques Derrida, that described it as a war against women. And that's true that
Okay.
there were aspects of it that were very gendered, and women experienced the conflict in a different way in Algeria, but most of the casualties for at least the first few years of the war were actually men. And so I think those jokes kind of, in Abdurrahman Musawi, my work is kind of just supporting his observation that there was a lot to do with a bit of how those circumstances made it so that men were kind of struggling a little bit with an identity of sorts of, we want to be really dignified and want to keep our dignity in the face of this violence, but it's just so horrific, and we're feeling like we're not able to kind of perform masculinities in the way that we want to. But keeping in mind that Algerian masculinities are very broad.
Hmm. What about the humor in the time of colonization and after the independence? Is there a major change or same
So
patterns?
I think so. If we're looking at Algerian use of political humor, I think there's actually a lot of continuity, and that humor was a way to think about. And I'm sorry, I'm starting to hear my daughter's like calling for me. Can
Okay, so
you
the
hear
last
mama,
minute.
mama?
If you
Yeah,
want to pause the
yeah.
interview and
That's okay. I don't know if can you hear her in the background though?
no.
Okay, she was yelling mama, mama, so I was like, ooh.
Okay.
So I need to probably wrap things up. But I was saying that I think that there's actually, in terms of the way Algerian different individuals that were producing comedy or producing humor, it seems like from kind of the extent humor that we have, right? So like a lot of the oral jokes. I wasn't able to get too many because it's been such a long time. I couldn't find any evidence that French officials were writing down jokes, like they were kind
Mm,
of surveying theater, but they weren't necessarily, I don't think, surveying. There were some satirical songs that were really popular,
okay.
and there's good writing on that. But there was sort of this idea that humor was a tool that could be used to try to craft or think about what it meant to be Algerian. And that's something that really is a common thread that actually cuts across colonization and decolonization. We're through the 60s, 70s, state actors, but also artists working under the state that had a little bit of freedom here and there, keeping in mind that artists working for the state didn't necessarily always support the state, and there were kind of subtle ways of passing messages, especially through humor. But this sort of question of sort of what does it mean to be Algerian comes up. So these plays and comedies taking place in 1930s by Tarzi are thinking about sort of what's the best future for Algeria? Should we try to have more of a harmonious relationship with France, or is it better to kind of go and kind of be our own community and continue to be our own community? And so there were some plays that had humor that focused on inter-religious couples. So what might happen if there's maybe a happy couple that ends up being, and he actually had different plays that had different messages, which was kind of interesting. But then also the FLN using during the time of the revolution, using cartoons as a way of making fun of French officials, but also showing this very dignified, and that's the cover of the cartoon, like a dignified fighter or Falah, like really kind of going and kicking the butt of the a huge French politician, but kind of this regaining dignity and thinking about sort of what national
Mm,
identity. And in the late and then the 60s, the bande dessinée culture really starts. The state starts to support the creation of bande dessinée in Algeria and cartoons because they want to make sure, and there are FLN documents that show this. They were and newspaper articles that show this. There was a concern that there needed to be Algerian superheroes because they didn't want the youth of the time to look at American cartoons
mhm.
or French cartoons and think that the superhero was French or American. And that was
Okay.
in part because they were concerned. They wanted to make sure that I think this was a genuine concern. They wanted to make sure that the youth understood the dangers of those imperial figures, and that imperialism was still a danger for Algeria. And so this American, if you're reading like some sort of Superman cartoons, you're
Mhm.
going to see this American, but then you're also going to see on the news this American soldier doing a horrible thing in Vietnam, or a horrible white
Okay.
American soldier, white American police officer doing something horrible in Alabama or Arkansas, right? So the state
Mm,
was much like trying to make sure that the citizens knew that there were these horrible cases of racism, imperialism still going on in the world, and that they wanted to make sure that Algerian youth had Algerian figures to look up to. And so they start to create Algerian superheroes and Algerian figures to kind of replace that. And some of them ended up very
nice.
popular, some didn't. But yeah.
Wow. شكرا جزيلا. يعطيك الصحة على وقتك.
يفتح عليك، يعطيك الصحة.
See you in Algiers maybe.
إن شاء الله، إن شاء الله.
إن شاء
يعطيك
الله.
الصحة على الفرصة، يعطيك الصحة. راني فرحانة بزاف مع المقابلة، وإن شاء الله تعجبك المقابلة شوية مع
آآ
will please your listeners too.
يعطيك
And
الصحة.
I'm always happy to share parts of the book, or it is in English, but I can explain things or speak with anyone. Yeah, I have public email stuff about from a university. Awesome.
awesome. شكرًا.
Much.
نهارك
And
مبروك ومع السلامة.
يعطيك الصحة، بالسلامة، يبقى على خير.
سلامة. سعيد.
عايش.